I have to admit that I think most of the things in my life that are good, I would have to attribute mostly to chance or fate, or if you prefer to sound more religious, to God's grace, which is what I tend to attribute it to. I think very few things in my life are attributed to some sort of sense of success or even skill that I can have some kind of sense of pride about it. There is one small thing, though, in my life that I tend to feel like I have some sense of accomplishment or pride over it, and that's my strawberry garden. I started out with this barren, dead patch some years ago, some wasteland of empty barrenness, and now, years later, it has turned into this beautifully cultivated, meticulously kept strawberry patch. But don't go look at it right now because it's full of weeds. It's been overtaken by the fall weeds. It's something that I'm rather not only proud of, but it's weird how you look at it and I'm like, ooh, I did something. It went from a barren wasteland to a well-kept, well-manicured garden, and it's productive, and I can feed people out of it. I get like 200 pounds of strawberries out of it in a year. This is a great thing. And now I have this new sense of accomplishment because I worked with my father this year, and I made wine out of my strawberries, and so I got like 14 of those 750s out of my strawberries, just a portion of them, and I thought, this is really good. By the way, if you want wine, selling it for like $100 a bottle or something. I'm just kidding. There is something, right, that you get this sense of accomplishment, this sense of forming a substance, just stuff into something, and you get not just a sense of pride, but you say, well, look, we made something. We did something. We took the nothing and made it into something. And it's weird, some people feel that about their families, right? Some people look at their students and they think that about their students. Some people look at their home and they say they've turned their home into something. And then there's some sense, right, in which when you watch the things in front of you all fall apart, it is destructive to your soul at an unknown level. You've probably noticed that even in yourself, that when it all starts to fall apart right in front of you, you say, now it's turned back into just a mess. Now it's a chaotic, ugly mess. Now it's destruction and chaos. It hurts, right? It's downright painful. When my car sits in pieces, and I just look at it, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do about that now. Right? When the chainsaw that wasn't quite working right, and I rip it all apart, it sits on the workbench now for the last 6 months because I just can't have the guts to try to put it back together, and I know I'll never figure it out, so I'm just going to give up now and stare at the parts. It drives me crazy just to have it sit there as a thing of junk, and it's showing me, it's pointing out, right, just how unable I am to take the stuff of life and form it into something good and powerful and meaningful. And I would suspect that all of us, right, we can say, oh, here's one area of my life where I could actually take the substance and the stuff and make something out of it. But for every one area where I have some small amount of success, the entirety of the universe presents me with a billion places where I am powerless. And that ought to be downright terrifying and incredibly humbling. The entire universe is filled with more matter, with more protons, neutrons, particles, more substance and stuff that you have no power over, you cannot control, that is beyond your grasp than you can ever imagine. This is what Genesis presents us with. We are in the middle of a study, the beginning of a study of Genesis, and last week we wanted to just take away one big point, that there is one God who made everything so that he could have a forever family. That's what Genesis big picture wants to lead us to. Just one God who wants to give us a forever family. One of our commentators pointed out, he said, it's the beginning of the salvation history. It's not a textbook trying to teach you all of the aspects and the pieces of creation. It is simply the story of a God who wants to show you that he made everything so he could have a family for himself. Now that's crucial then, because as you and I come to grips with the substance of the stuff of life that is so far beyond our ability to shape and mold and form and control, we have somebody that's there still to work with us. And Genesis chapter 2, 1 verse 2, presents us with this challenge in a very particular way. He says this. First, let's review Genesis 1 verse 1. Last week, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I want to remind us all, when you hear the heavens and the earth, you likely think of something like this. Most likely to you right now, that just looks like a big black blob, which is basically all it is. But this is the famous image that was taken by the Hubble telescope just approximately 10 years ago. It was an update of the old picture of the Hubble telescope, and it showed us that there are more than probably 2 trillion galaxies in the universe. When you and I think heavens and earth, that's probably what we tend to think. And for earth, we probably think this. This is the famous blue marble picture. It was taken back in 1972. I learned something as I looked at this picture. Did you know that historically, when the picture was first taken, it was the other direction? It was upside down. But we popularized, nobody wanted to look at the world upside down, so we popularized a version of it that's right side up. It's got the North Pole on the top instead of on the bottom. The whole picture was inverted originally. I found that out. Anyway, this is probably what you think of, right? When you think heavens and earth. The problem is, in the Bible, it's much simpler than that. The phrase heavens and earth is used in the Bible more than a dozen times exactly like this. It's used with variety in phrases like, lift up your eyes to the heavens and look at the earth beneath. The heavens will vanish like smoke, and the earth will wear out like a garment, and its inhabitants die like flies. Heavens and earth, what it means in the Bible, is just that. Right? They stood on a plain. This is the plain outside of Bethlehem, on the east side of Bethlehem, and they said, look, there's the earth, and there's the heavens. It means for us something much more like sky and land. That's all heavens and earth means. So what we're saying is, after verse 1, something like this is what has been made. Something like this is what has been shaped. Now, before we go on, though, I want to remind us and say, just because that's what verse 1 would have meant to an ancient Jewish person, that doesn't mean that it can't mean this to us. In fact, isn't it remarkable that God could reveal through his writers that he made the heavens and the earth, and all it meant to those Jewish people was this, but it can mean this to us all at the same time? God put more wisdom into the scriptures than we could imagine. They would have never thought of this, and yet that could easily lead to the blue marble. What a great thing that he did. So there's this image of what the earth probably was working towards when he first created it. There's one problem with this image, though. Have you figured it out yet? It's in Genesis 1 verse 2. Look at Genesis 1 verse 2, which is our scripture verse for today. Do you want to read this with me, please? Read it with me. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of the God was hovering over the waters. So, did Genesis 1 verse 1 look like this? No, it looked more like that. My chaotic mess of a living room, or my Lego table in the basement, a chaotic mess. Nobody really knows exactly what Genesis 1 verse 1 looked like when it was done, but listen to those words that are in Genesis 1 verse 1. It was formless, it said. The universe, and especially whatever the substance was some shapeless blob of material. It was empty. So if you have your Bible open, right, it says it was empty. It didn't just lack vegetation and creatures. It lacked any kind of features. No dry land. When we say heavens and earth, and we might think we mean something like this, right, like that dry land, but it's a total misnaming. It was nothing. It was a blob. There were no mountains or lakes or oceans or anything. Now, I know how can you really have something that doesn't have form? I have a really hard time imagining that, right? How can you have something that doesn't have any form? I don't know. It baffles my mind. But there was darkness. All the matter that existed was shrouded in darkness, and there was the deep. Some kind of, we like to use the word primordial ooze. People like that word. It sounds cool to say. Water. This word, the deep, is used not for the inner places of the earth, but for the deep, deep water of the ocean. That's what existed in the beginning. After God created the heavens and the earth, it was a shapeless, formless mass of matter. It was primordial potential, people like to say. Now, nobody really knows what this might have looked like. I tried to spend a meaningful amount of time looking for a picture, some suggestion of what it would have looked like. You know, you can find plenty of pictures of the universe and all the stars and the planets. You can find plenty of recreations of the blue marble and all of what Genesis chapter 1 might have looked like. You know what nobody wants to picture? Genesis 1 verse 2. What does a shapeless, formless mass of darkness look like? You can't find it. There's just a couple of renditions. Here's one by a man named Rick Rietveld. It's not even dark enough, but he had to put some light so you could see something of chaotic darkness and matter that is shapeless. He or somebody else made it look kind of like a purple aurora. But the point is to say, when you read Genesis 1 verse 2 there, you should picture darkness in a chaotic substance. That's all there was. Now what does that mean for us? Right? What is this verse telling us, or what does this verse try to show us? Well, there's three different major ways that we have tried to get meaning out of this verse. What is God trying to tell us with this verse? He could have just skipped it. Why did he put this verse into the scriptures for us? Why did he feel like it's important to tell us, I made everything, but it was just an ugly blob? Right? Now, if you were trying to tell people about your latest and greatest great creation at work, I have a pretty good guess that you wouldn't say, I made a new thing today at work, but it was just an ugly blob. Nobody would be very impressed. And yet God did, right? God said, I made this grand thing that we call the universe, the earth, and the heavens. But it was formless. It was shapeless. It was empty and void. It was ugly. Why did God do that? First, some people suggest, well, the way to think about this is what's called a gap theory or recreation. And this one says that Genesis 1:1 tells us of the creation of the world, and then there was a long gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Then disaster struck the world, and the world fell into sin. And so what we hear in Genesis 1 verse 2 is actually a story of the world having fell into some kind of disaster or chaos. Perhaps you envision an asteroid hitting the earth and everything getting destroyed. This idea was popularized by Thomas Chalmers and Charles Schofield in what's called dispensationalism. Now, here's the thing. There's no real reason in the text to think that God didn't want this formlessness on the earth. Genesis 1 verse 2 doesn't start, but the earth was formless. There's no reason to stick a lot of years in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 in the text. And most importantly, right, there's no reason to think that God didn't want the empty, formless space of Genesis 1 verse 2. Now, the second thing that people suggest that maybe we can understand out of Genesis 1 verse 2 is that God actually created the world from something. This theory is often used to connect the story of creation in the Bible with a lot of modern science or a lot of scientific insights. And it says that there was maybe a lot of time, maybe even billions of years, and then all of a sudden God came along and he said, let's actually make something good out of all of this matter. And so he created out of the something, he formed it into the beautiful world that we get in the rest of Genesis. So that is one thing that some people suggest. What it does is it tries to work with this, right, very, very old universe. The problem with it is that Christians have always suggested, have always argued that God made the world out of nothing. Here's your one fancy Latin word for the day. It's called creation ex nihilo. How's your Latin now? Creation ex nihilo. That God created the world out of nothing by his word. Passages in the scriptures tell us this. For example, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command. So what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Nothing visible existed. It's not like God started with something and made something out of it. So the one issue that we would always have with this suggestion that God created the world from something is that the rest of the scriptures tell us that God started with nothing. And 2 Maccabees tells us how the Jewish people even held to this idea. So this is not something new that the Christians just made up. Here's a verse. It doesn't matter the context too much, but I beg you, child, to look at the heavens and the earth and see all that is in them. Then you will know that God did not make them out of existing things. The world had to start with nothing, at least as far as what the Jewish people thought, and the Christians held to the same idea. Now, so if it's not the gap theory, and if it's not a creation from something, what do we take from Genesis 1 verse 2? I'm going to call it substantive stuff. I know it's my profound thought for the day. But it's simply this, that God really did create shapeless, formless stuff, nothingness. And if that bugs you a little bit, well, maybe it should. Maybe you should think to yourself, why would God waste the time to just make shapeless and formless and empty nothingness? That's a good question, isn't it? I think about it a little bit. Imagine that you're out taking a drive one beautiful Tuesday afternoon. You're taking your kids to a soccer game, and you come back past this beautiful setting, and you think to yourself, what a lovely looking place. I wonder what I could do with that. As you drive past, then you think, well, I suppose I could come and hunt on it. I bet there's some nice deer there, maybe some turkeys. I could set up a nice blind. I wonder if the owner is interested in letting me use the land. Or you could drive past and you could think to yourself, I bet we could farm the land. We could till it up and plant some nice crops there and turn it into some useful produce. That would be good too, right? Or you drive past this empty lot and you think to yourself, I know, that is the ideal setting for my retirement home. I want a tranquil piece of land outside of town where I can have quiet and enjoy the sunrises and the sunsets. You could think all of those things, right? But you can especially think I could build a nice quiet home outside of town on that nice spot of land. What do you have? You have a primitive potential. You have primordial potential that you could shape. You have substantive stuff that you could turn into anything. It's not a terrible thing to start with just substance. No, it means that you have some opportunity. It means there's space for creativity. It means you have a chance to form it into something that you want, and you can let it have some freedom to express itself and develop itself. But it is also filled with danger, isn't it? Because if you don't take care of that land, and you don't trim that land, and you don't put something on that land, what's it going to turn into? In a couple of years, you're going to have that. An overgrown woodlot. An ugly mess. Now, you might say, oh, I like that. But it's going to be filled with ticks and poison ivy and weeds, noxious weeds. And they're going to eat you alive when you try to walk out on that beautiful piece of property. Or you can come along, right? And you can take care of it. You can trim it. And you can build yourself a nice little house to enjoy the serene setting. That's what Genesis 1 verse 2 pictures for us, I would suggest. God had substantive stuff to work with, and he had an opportunity to form it into something wonderful or to let it go. Now think about what that says for you and for me. It's not just that the world is filled with substantive stuff that we can work with, but it's that ultimately you and I are the substantive stuff that God wants to work with. And you have a chance to be formed and shaped into the beautiful, serene setting where God lives and works. Or you can become the overgrown, ugly woodlot filled with poison ivy and poison oak and noxious weeds and mosquitoes and ticks that's destructive to the rest of humanity. I realize that I'm jumping all the way down, right, from this primordial potential, from the substantive stuff, all the way to the end of the story, but the story is leading us to this very point. It's suggesting to you and I that if God does not create something good in us, we have just as much a chance of being this ugly mess. And how do you know that? Because how does verse 2 end? Verse 2 ends with this great punchline: the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. There's only one way for you and I, this substantive stuff in all of creation, to become something wonderful, something beautiful, something that makes this great impact on society, and that's one thing: the Spirit of God. The only way to become this is if the Spirit of God will give you life. Otherwise, all of creation, this primordial potential, this substantive stuff, this chaotic mess, will head into disaster. You need the Spirit to give you life. And friends, I hope that you have that life. I hope that you have that Spirit, and that through that Spirit you come alive, and that Spirit shapes you and forms you into this great setting where God is at work in you. You can be confident that God will be at work in you and that the Spirit wants you. Because the same Son of God, the same man who ached and cried out for the Spirit of God while he was suffering on the cross, is the Spirit that he gives to you in your baptisms. And because he gave up that Spirit, you know that you will always have the Spirit of God. That the life of God lives in you and will create you into this new person. May that always be yours. As the substantive stuff, right, heads not to sin, but into the Spirit. That's what we want to learn from today. That the substantive stuff can be filled either with sin or the Spirit. And I pray, I hope, I want more than anything, that as you see the one who gave up his Spirit, that you would be filled with that Spirit and that life. So let's confess our faith this morning with the words of the Nicene Creed and ask that God would give us his Spirit more and more, and we would be filled with that Spirit for life. Let's stand as we confess together.